Amazing. So we're looking at the story of Abraham this morning. And as a church, we're approaching our 10th birthday. So we want to spend the next few weeks concentrating on God's faithfulness because we want to celebrate all that we've seen over the past decade as a church. And last week, Jim spoke about how even when we feel out of our depth, his faithfulness is with us wherever we go. And this week, we're thinking about how God is faithful to all of his promises. And I want to talk about how trust in God's faithfulness can grow in the waiting. So for those that don't know me, I'm an get everything done yesterday type of person. I'm not usually very good at waiting. And I wondered, is anyone else here actually quite good at waiting? Who has a lot of patience? Anybody in the room have a lot of patience? Or are you all like me and not very good at waiting? There's one or two hands have gone up. Well done if you are patient and good at waiting, but I really am not. The point at which I do slow down and I'm quite happy to wait is when something requires significant trust, where there's high risk involved. At that point, I'm quite willing to wait. When I was 19, I was on a trip in South Africa by myself with some friends, and I ended up on the longest zip line in the southern hemisphere. I don't know if it still is, but it was at the time. And the longest stretch of that zip line was 700 meters long, and it went out over the top of a gorge. You hit top speeds of around 25 miles an hour, which doesn't sound that fast when I say it now, but when your only braking system is a gardening glove on your hand, as you can see in this picture, I was somewhat petrified. So this is a picture of me at 19, pretending I'm totally fine with the situation when really I was not. I was not the first person to jump up and say, I want to go first. In fact, I was very happy to wait as long as possible for others to have a go. I wanted to check that they were still okay at the other end and that their hand remained intact. But after witnessing the first few people zoom off down this zip line, I grew in confidence that I could indeed get down this zip line okay. It was actually amazing fun. The journey up, however, was actually the most petrifying bit of my life, but that's a story for another day. Earlier in the service, I added this little toy into this water. And if I was to take it out now, in fact, I will, you will see, I know it's tiny, but you will see it's actually no bigger than it was before. It's still about 2 centimeters big. The packet said that when I leave it in water, it can grow up to 600% of its original size. But you see, I only put it into the water about 10 minutes ago, and it hasn't changed at all. It's still just 2 centimeters tall. Now, it's time this morning for my great Blue Peter moment, saying, here's one I made earlier. So here is a jug of disgusting-looking water in which you might be able to see, if I can get it out, that the toy has, in fact, grown. It's still quite small, but it definitely hasn't grown 600%, but it is a little bit bigger. There's a picture on the screen so you can see the size. I measured it this morning. It's definitely not grown 6 times the size, but it is a little bit bigger. On Tuesday, Kath put it in water for me, and as a result, it's grown. But actually, it hasn't grown anywhere near as much as I thought it would. We saw in the video today snippets from the life of Abraham's story. He's a man that followed God before Jesus was born, and he's someone who didn't see God's promise happen straight away. In Genesis chapter 22, which is the first book of the Bible, which is all about the first people who followed God, we see God promise Abraham that he would be a man from whom many descendants, that means many children, would come. And he even says he would have as many descendants as there are stars in the sky and grains of sand on the seashore. But over Abraham's life, we didn't actually see anything happen straight away, or in the ways in which he tried to make it happen. Abraham had been promised children, even though he was already quite old. We see throughout the book of Genesis, God remind Abraham and Sarah of that promise. But years and years pass by, and they still have no children. And the longer that they didn't have children, the less likely they thought it was that they would end up with children. And the promise felt more and more distant the longer that it wasn't fulfilled. But God is faithful to all his promises. The longer the time passed, the more God reminded them of his promise. And eventually, when Abraham was 100 years old, his wife Sarah gave birth to their son Isaac. And we see Abraham described in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, as someone who lived faithfully, only seeing a tiny amount of what God had promised come to pass. In the moment, Abraham only saw this. In the moment, Abraham only saw a tiny bit of what God had promised. But for us, we get to see the full story, not just in the Bible, but for us stood here today. And we get to see the reality of it. We get to see that it's grown, that God has been faithful to his promise. But there was a journey to get to that place. Now, here's a little video of what happened in the Salt House this week. You'll have to give it quite a lot of attention because it's not easy to see. So it's quite tricky to see, but it has grown. It did flop over. I was hoping Jesus might walk on water, but it didn't happen. He needed to stay underneath in the glass. But you will see moment by moment, it did grow over time. It didn't just jump from being this tiny thing to being this slightly bigger version. It didn't just jump to that stage. It grew over time. In the waiting, something is always happening. The waiting gives us an opportunity to grow in trust of God's faithfulness. So when I eventually took the plunge and jumped off that platform in South Africa, I did so after witnessing other people entrust their lives to the equipment that we were using. Abraham's life teaches us what a life of faithfulness looks like in response to the promises of a faithful God. We can read about it and see it and watch it and hear of God's faithfulness, not just from the stories in the Bible, but from one another as well. We all have a part to play in each other's faith journey and encouraging each other in God's faithfulness. Not seeing what we want to see doesn't make God's faithfulness to his promise any less true. In fact, it makes it even more amazing when we do get to witness some of the fulfillment of God's promise. The waiting gives us space to trust on his faithfulness and trust that it will grow. Where for you does it feel like all you see at the moment is this? It might feel like nothing has changed, or the changes are so small they're hardly noticeable. Maybe you know that God promises to provide, but you haven't yet seen provision in something that you long to. Maybe you know that God promises to give strength to the weak, but you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed or tired this morning. Maybe you know that God gives hope to the hopeless, but you need God to remind you of that this morning. As we see in the Bible story today, we have a God who is faithful to all his promises, and that we will see them pass from generation to generation. We know that he is faithful to his promises. Do you know what? We'll never know when we look back on our story as a family of churches. We will never know in the next 10 years who's going to be looking at our story as a church. But in generations to come, our story here and now will be part of God's faithfulness to the city of Lincoln in showing his love, in seeing people live more like Jesus and bringing transformation to lives and communities. Imagine if we live knowing, really, truly knowing that God is always faithful to his promises. How might that change how we approach the waiting, both when things are going well and when things aren't? How might the knowledge that he's faithful to all his promises transform our own faithfulness to God and our own obedience to his call on our lives? Can I invite you to stand, and we're going to pray and worship together.